Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. Today's guest needs little introduction because Hunter Walk is one of the friendliest and most accessible venture capitalists working in tech today. But as you know by now, if I have a VC on the show, that probably means they've done some interesting venturing in addition to their capitaling. And that's certainly the case with Hunter, who in this episode will share with us 3 very interesting stories about things we actually haven't had a chance to cover much yet on this show. Second Life, Google AdSense, and YouTube. Small bit of housekeeping here. By the time you are listening to this, my second child has either been delivered or is about to be so. And so either way, it might be a couple of weeks before I am able to release a new episode. I'll keep you updated on Twitter if you're interested. In the meantime, please enjoy this amazing conversation with Hunter Walk. Hunter Walk, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you're not, just to touch on background for a little bit, you never trained as an engineer.
No. I call myself sort of technically curious, technically proficient, but not technically trained.
You were a history major.
I was a history major, and my sort of entryway to tech as a kid wasn't through command line programming, was actually more through desktop publishing, graphic design. I was kind of always the junior high, high school editor of the newspaper, and I remember watching desktop publishing, computer software, transform that from something where I was physically laying out articles on large sheets of paper to just clicking, dragging, and being able to do it all virtually.
So you got your BA at Vassar and then an MBA from Stanford, but you also had a public access show at Vassar?
I did. So I was multi-platform in my early years. I was sports editor at the Vassar paper, which is somewhat oxymoronic given that Vassar's not known for their athletic pursuits, but I decided that it would be fun to interview some of my friends who are on the various sports teams and not just do it for print, but do it for video. So went down to my local Comcast, got a time slot, and had a half-hour TV show for a couple of months.
I just thought that there was a nice little historical rhyme there because now you would have a YouTube channel. We'll get to that.
Exactly. Whenever I tell that story, people say, well, did you upload that to YouTube? And I said, no, those tapes are safely buried in my parents' basement, never to see the light of day.
So one thing that everybody always asks you about, and I can't resist also, you had an early job or internship with the Conan O'Brien show.
Yeah, so that's connected to the sort of public access in the sense that I was having a blast doing sort of this low, zero budget, low rent public access. And I wanted to see if that was, single A baseball. I wanted to see what the pro leagues were like. I had an internship at NBC 2 summers earlier in a different division, but used that to kind of wrangle my way into the production side of the business. And spent my senior year of college coming into the city from Vassar, which is Poughkeepsie, about 90 minutes north of Manhattan. Coming to the city 3 days a week to work on Late Night with Conan O'Brien. It was its second season. It was on at 1:30 in the morning. We taped, of course, closer to sort of 5:36 at night, but was still finding its footing, was only on a quarterly renewal cycle. So basically, the team there started sort of, each quarter not knowing if there would be a show 3 months from now. But it was a blast. I worked in the research team, which essentially meant I researched celebrity guests, wrote interview questions, and tried to manufacture spontaneity.
I think I heard also you did stand-ins because you're about the same height as Conan.
Yeah. So of the sort of intern crew, I was one of the taller ones. So even though most of my time was spent behind the scenes, every once in a while, Hunter Walk, could you come to the studio floor? And it was essentially I had to stand on an X tape X on the for 10 minutes while they got the lighting right.
I met him once, and aside from the hair, the thing that really stood out to me was like, God, he's tall.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, I'm 6'3", and I think he had probably had 1.5 2 inches on me.
yeah. So, were you thinking of maybe going into entertainment, like doing TV or arts or media or something like that?
I really was. At that point in my life, I was trying to figure out if I was left brain or right brain. My mother, artist and art teacher, father did more traditional business, and I was trying to figure out which one of them I most took after, which had me moving back and forth between more creative pursuits like the time on Conan, or being a history major and writing a thesis on the first national women's magazine in the U.S., stuff like that, and wanting to learn how Microsoft Excel worked. I was kind of the only kid at Vassar who got Ad Age delivered to the dorm, and I was fascinated by sort of the advertising side of media and brands and things like that. It wasn't really until I started to, got out west for grad school at Stanford and started to embrace consumer tech as a profession, not just sort of a nerdy hobby, that I realized it had room for people who were both left brain and right brain thinkers. I didn't have to decide one path or the other. But yeah, there was definitely a point, like if I think of my sort of career decision tree, the biggest split, the most impactful split was, do I stay on Conan and try to be in entertainment, media, journalism for a living? Or do I go down a different path, which at the time was management consulting, which I did for a few years, but ultimately more kind of a business builder, company route.
I feel like that's a weird answer, that Excel was sort of your path into tech, but
Excel it's just a beautiful interface on a bunch of command line programs.
I just did one of the Tesla co-founders, and they were talking about modeling the company when they're doing the R&D stage, and he's like, we did it all in Excel.
Yeah.
He's like, no 3D modeling. No, we just the math works.
Excel is still, sort of maybe gloriously or tragically, sort of the most important enterprise software tool out there. And just, for context, so I was born in 1973, because I'm 42, turning 43 this year. So when I say, second year of Conan, Vassar, I was class of 95. A lot of the things that if I was coming out even just 10 years later, 2005, I wouldn't have ended up in management consulting. I wouldn't have been talking about Excel. Maybe I still would have been wrestling with the right brain, left brain challenge. I don't think that was of a time frame, but especially if you didn't come up through the ranks as sort of an engineer or from a family that was deep in the sciences, you went into management consulting or you went into investment banking, and I knew I didn't want to be a banker. So I thought the problem-solving nature of management consulting might be interesting for a few years.
Well, it sounds like, seeing as how you only did it for a few years, that maybe doing management consulting convinced you that that wasn't the path for you either.
Well,
eventually.
I figured that out within the first year, and then used my remaining sort of time there to kind of steer my career in a different direction, which is ultimately what led me to be out on the West Coast. Not even just from Stanford, but I had worked on a project in San Francisco with my firm for about 9 months, and that opened my eyes to everything that was going on in the Bay Area, and started to sort of set a path to get back there.
So I'm gonna have you tell us a little bit about Linden Labs, but first, I think you do a little bit of time at Mattel, but what leads you to Linden Labs and around 2000, I think?
Yeah, so I went out to grad school in 1998. The MBA program is a 2-year program, finished up 2000. You referenced Mattel. I mean, that was really the first piece in sort of putting me at Linden. I'd always wanted to work for a toy company. My dad, when I was a kid, worked for JCPenney, sort of corporate in New York, and when I'd go visit him, if he had a meeting or something before we'd get together, he'd drop me off at the floor where the sort of the toy testers worked. They would decide what toys JCPenney should carry in its catalog and its retail stores. I was like, my God, this is the best job in the world. I want to work, for a toy company at some point. And so going to spend a summer at Mattel, specifically working with Mattel Interactive on a buy, build, or partner video game strategy, re-immersed me in that world. And what struck me during that summer 99, was the changing nature of play and of video games. And it was moving from a, sort of fully scripted, non-malleable world that you would play through, which I had sort of growing up with my Super Nintendo and that type of stuff, to a collaborative environment or competitive environment you could play together, and increasingly a world that was responsive to your touch. At this time, sort of The Sims was a big PC game, and you were able to feel like you were actually changing the path of the world you were in. Some of the first sort of massively multiplayer games like Ultima Online and things were also coming out, sort of come for the game, stay for the community type of stuff. And so I got very excited and interested in how video games and interactive entertainment were being changed by the web. So when I was finishing up grad school in 2000, I was talking with Yahoo Games and Electronic Arts and the different folks in the Bay Area, but just felt like they weren't looking into the future radically enough. It was sort of hey, instead of playing checkers against the computer, you can play checkers against somebody else. And that was cool, undoubtedly. But I happened upon a small company getting started in San Francisco called Linden Labs, and the vision they had for sort of Legos on steroids, or ultimately probably the most evocative sort of success story, was something what Minecraft sort of turned into. And right, they were creating this virtual world called Second Life, and it was some of the smartest people I'd met and trying something really audacious, and so I leapt in.
Could you, since we haven't touched on it on the show at all, can you give us just briefly like the origin story of Linden Lab? Is it just Phil Rosedale? Yeah. And he came from Real Networks.
Yep.
And so then what was his vision? What was he trying to do?
Absolutely. So the company's called Linden Lab. The product is Second Life. It's still now around. It's been profitable for a number of years. Jokingly, you could claim that Second Life is more profitable than Twitter, Uber, Airbnb ever have been. But Philip, amazing guy, had come from Real Networks, where he was running Real Video. He had started an early sort of video conferencing startup that Real had purchased. It became kind of the backbone of Real Video. He was CTO of Real Networks. And for a long time, Philip, in sort of his wild-eyed imagination, had been thinking about a world that people could construct together, a simulation where you could change the world around you. A little bit Snow Crash, metaverse, right. A little bit, sort of a almost religious type of notion of a world not created, by a deity, but created by the people in it. And he felt like it was finally the right time. And by right time, it was a combination of broadband beginning to emerge and be deployed. This was one of the first experiences that required broadband. Graphics cards. It was the age of the NVIDIA GeForce 2 and sort of the first GPU cards in $500, $750 Dell desktops that could power high performance gaming simulation environments. Mm-hmm. And also, I think, the right time in his life. He had made some money when Real went public, felt like he could now turn to something. He was not just the founder, but one of the first sizable investors, but was time to sort of sail his ship back to something that he'd always wanted to build. And so called Linden Lab for two reasons. Linden, because we were on Linden Alley in Hayes Valley in San Francisco, and Lab because Philip had always wanted a lab. Mm-hmm. And so the first product was Second Life. It was the idea of an immersive environment. It started out, the company, which when I joined was Philip, 3 to 4 engineers, and then I was the first non-engineer at the company. They had started out, and actually I think still probably hold some patents on haptic interfaces. So if you're going to project yourself into a fully immersive environment, the initial idea was that maybe a mouse and a keyboard are barriers to being fully immersed.
Or not the best tool.
Yeah. So we had a fully functioning sort of rig that you'd step into. We had a glove type of interface. Had sort of a full machine shop, on premise. And what happened was, as the team, and most of the hardware work was done before I got there, as the team started realizing that yes, this was interesting, but if you didn't, maybe you needed to build the world first. That there weren't worlds being created that these interfaces would make sense in. So let's actually build the world and then think about interfaces. And so they started to create what became Second Life, which was a fully immersive simulation of a geography that should feel and look very much like the Earth. It had trees, land, so on and so forth. and it was spread out over servers. So the idea was that each, this was when you were sort of starting to get the decreasing price of like pizza box servers, which they called pizza box servers because they're up the side of a pizza box. And for each server you racked, you could run, it was either 16 or 20 acres of simulation. And part of the IP that this company had built was the land was contiguous. As a user, you wouldn't know when you're actually being transferred from one server to another. And it was shared. So as opposed to shards, which would be sort of a term for like in the gaming world where each instance of a game would hold so many users, and then you'd create a exact replica of that same game environment to hold the next 1,000 users, the next 1,000 users. This was one world that as it got larger, you just kept adding
more servers,
cheap servers to create a larger and larger contiguous world. We would debate what would happen when the first users should step into this world. On one end of the spectrum, you could imagine Disney World. They should find a set of fully formed experiences that we had built that would be fun in and of themselves, and then they could start building other things using sort of primitive kind of geography, 3D modeling tools, scripting language, but fundamentally there need to be something for them to do. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you could think of it as virtual Burning Man, a community that's based upon the need to collaborate in order to
do anything.
Exist.
But also we should point out that one of the main features was also the creation of your avatar and your ability to make your avatar be whatever you wanted.
So you're represented in this world by a humanoid avatar, highly customizable, both in terms of appearance, skins, things you could upload into the world to dress yourself. So you design in a Photoshop maybe, and then upload something. It wasn't just pick from this menu of virtual shirts you could wear. And also highly sculptable and slider bars that can move all these things. We did have some constraints because we used to say like, well, it's kind of a prisoner's dilemma. If you can be as large as you want, everybody's going to be large, and like that doesn't make sense. So, we sort of said you could only be so big, you could only be so small, but within that, highly, highly customizable. And what we found was it was one of the most interesting areas of a lot of people started doing research on Second Life once it got going because it was just sort of this fascinating laboratory of kind of a different type of online behavior. And we found that people, when they had the chance to create a representation of themselves in that fashion, some people would go down the path of realistic. They wanted to look exactly like they did in the outside world. And some people would want to do unrealistic, at least in terms of unrealistic compared to sort of how they looked. And then unrealistic would split into two paths. One would be your typical maybe it's a cultural symbol of attractive. So if you wanted to be a female avatar, you'd have unrealistic proportions and muscles and long blonde hair. And if you were a male avatar, you'd be all hulked out or stuff like that. But there were a not insignificant minority who went down the unrealistic, sort of repulsive / fantastic path. They wanted to, be as fat as you could be, or as skinny as you could be,
or have an eagle's head,
or because we had different we called them attach points, so you could actually sort of create, ornament yourself in a way that almost would be like putting on a costume at Disney World. You could become a furry or whatever.
Right, yeah.
People would do amazing anime costumes. So we started to see a real expressiveness that started to answer a lot of questions of, if you could look like anything, what would you look like and why?
Well, so the obvious, thinking of it in 2016, you're thinking of now the move to VR, and this is an antecedent to that. But also putting it in the context, because Second Life has this cultural moment where all of a sudden it explodes into the consciousness, and brands are trying to put car dealerships in Second Life, and there's a whole economy that develops.
Oh yeah.
And so I think it sort of is forgotten as sort of on this cusp of when Web 2.0 happens, that this is in that sort of milieu of letting the users free and
right.
And
you had mainstream publications saying, "Will we all be living a Second Life?" I think we had sort of these two waves, one small and one large, of bumping our heads on the mainstream. The first occurred while I was there. It was as we were building, and once we went into our public beta, it really, I think, because of the metaverse nature of it, the creative nature of it, a lot of technologists recognized it for what it was, a really, really hard technical problem, an amazing simulation, and wanted to try it out. Time magazine called us one of the best inventions of the year. At a time where there weren't necessarily, not everybody was an angel investor, right? Second Life, during its first few years, couldn't really raise money from traditional venture investors. People thought it was crazy. But really significant tech luminaries like Mitch Kapor, who founded Lotus, Ray Ozzie, who was also at Lotus, but then went on to found some other companies Microsoft acquired.
Mitch was working with you guys at one point.
Yeah,
right?
Mitch was the sort of primary investor and board chair, so he was very hands-on for a while. Later, Pierre Omidyar from eBay became an investor. Jeff Bezos became an investor. So you had this set of really, really impressive, far-out thinkers who almost as like a crowd-funded project, just the donor level was in the 7 digits, right, as opposed to here $50 Kickstarter bonus. And so that was the first wave. Then it sort of went dark for a while because when I talked before earlier about are we Burning Man or are we Disney World, we ultimately decided we were Burning Man. So you needed the early true believers to sort of build out this world, or there was nothing for the next wave of adopters to actually experience. And building out a world is hard, even a virtual one. We had an in-world 3D modeling tool, an in-world scripting language. You mentioned sort of VR. We were also sort of a precursor to Bitcoin with a virtual currency called Linden dollars that you could actually, we powered an exchange. We wouldn't sell you dollars per se, but you could transact, you could sell your dollars, your virtual dollars to another user for real dollars, and we would take like a 2% cut. And so it had a real functioning economy as well.
I remember there was lots of studies about that.
And which was one of the drivers too of that next wave you're talking about, where you had people who were making millions of dollars in Second Life by building up businesses and converting those virtual dollars to real dollars. You had businesses starting to buy plots of land. Think of a plot of land in Second Life as the equivalent of a URL. So they were buying, URLs in Second Life that just happened to be physical simulations, and Dell wanted to, Dell built a virtual replica of Michael Dell's dorm room and then a Dell store that you could go buy computers. People would launch press releases. The first insurance agency to set up in Second Life. Newt Gingrich gave a speech. People were giving concerts. Everyone wanted it to be something that it actually wasn't, but the hype promoted it to people who the experience was not approachable. They were not ready for it. And so it sort of had its moment in the sun, and then the inevitable wave of disappointment when people found that sort of living in a self-organized virtual world wasn't the same as The Sims, or wasn't a 3D version of MySpace.
Right. Well, actually, so again, from the perspective of 2016, it's impossible not to look back at it and think, well, this is what Minecraft has become. So is there anything that you could see that was it just too early? Is there something Minecraft did different that found success or?
Yeah, I think so. I think the biggest difference, and I debate this with people regarding VR as well now. Does an immersive simulated environment need to be photorealistic? Does it need to spend so much computational power on gravity, on wind, on clouds?
Because that's what Linden Lab was trying.
That's what Linden Lab went down the path. Philip and others strongly believed that in order for you to suspend disbelief, in order to create a world that was appealing, we needed to mimic a lot of the things that were in this world. And so we had a real sort of like dynamic fluid pattern, managing the winds and clouds that would be generated and then be moved by that wind. We had a third-party physics engine that we integrated and constantly spent a lot of cycles on. We spent a lot of resources on texture streaming and progressive level of detail. So as you got closer and closer, it would be like looking at a brick wall in real life. You wanted that level of detail.
But what you're saying vis-a-vis VR is that maybe you don't have to focus on those things. You can go a long way with a lower base level of...
Minecraft created, anybody who has spent time in Minecraft knows that you can create a true emotional connection to an avatar, to an environment, to a simulation, without it having to be photorealistic. And I think good designers, good game designers, good designers in general, are thinking about what they're trying to achieve as that sense of place, that emotional connection. And it's unclear to me that the best vector for Second Life was to take the path we did of that photorealism, but it's what we believed and what we doubled down on. And it was ultimately, I think, part of the constraints because we spent so much time perfecting that, we didn't spend as much time thinking about the anthropology of it. We spent so much of the computing resources on it that you could only put 50 human avatars on a particular simulator, because beyond that it would slow down. If we had thought about it differently, maybe we would have optimized for saying, you know what, this isn't fun unless it's dense. Unless you can have a crowd,
1,000
a concert, 1,000 people, this is never going to happen. But we wanted trees and clouds and gravity.
Yeah. So you do mention that you're not there very long, maybe 3 or 4 years.
3 years, yeah. So from near the beginning through maybe a quarter or two after commercial launch in summer '03. So we opened it up in summer '03. Basically took our beta and started charging people. It was great. We had internally at that time we were probably about 15 people or so, and we held a little internal contest. What percentage of the beta users do you think are going to convert? And at the time, maybe we had 5,000 beta users. And on one end of the spectrum, Philip Rosedale, our founder, who's an incredible technologist, incredible optimist. In fact, he's building a company now called High Fidelity that's really sort of Second Life 2.0 in the VR space. But he looks and he sort of says 110%, which is essentially believing that like every beta user is going to convert, and 1 out of every 10 is going to bring a friend. Then you had some folks who had come up with other numbers. I was on the other end of the spectrum. I said 5%, because I felt like it still wasn't a very compelling place. A lot of people were, the engagement numbers, people had accounts, but they weren't all living in this world, that type of stuff. And I ended up being right. And I just remember this, Philip sort of had I could see there was like a 30-second pause where sort of there was a little bit of disappointment. And then, seeing the cup half full, as you have to if you're doing these long projects, he said, well, I guess if any one of us had to be right, I'm glad it's the business guy. So he's like, okay, your modeling is probably going to be correct. You got this right. Now let's get back to work and build a world.
Yeah.
And I remember that even as a moment of, in many ways let down. Oh, geez, this might not be working exactly the way that we had hoped. It's going to be a long road ahead. I remembered that as sort of the type of perseverance and resilience that you need if you're going to take a moonshot, if you're going to create something that's going to encounter skepticism, stopping points where you choose to stop or you choose to go on. And I think that's ultimately, sort of benefited me when I was at Google, and certainly, benefits me now as a sort of seed stage investor.
Right. So what leads you to Google? Did they recruit you, or?
At the time, so one of the implications of Second Life, 5% conversion as opposed to 110% conversion, we scaled up to about 30 people, and then we had this moment, 30 employees, and then we had this moment where we said, we can either try to raise more money, but frankly at the time, it wasn't going to be an attractive venture opportunity yet. Benchmark later came in, a great venture investor, and made a sizable commitment. But at the time, it wasn't working, and we needed more runway. So we cut from 30 to 20 people, and the job that I had at the time, which was some product, some marketing, and essentially the highest nail problem, whatever needed to get done, that job was disappearing. We were reducing to bare bones. And so looking around and seeing, well, what does this company need at this time, and what does this next phase look like? There wasn't a real fit for me. So, I essentially, for all intents and purposes, got laid off, right? And one of the things, though, that I was really excited about, we had built a social graph within Second Life. without knowing it. That's certainly not what we called it. We called it a contact list. It's much, like it was like a chat, and you could connect with people, and if you friended one another, you could communicate via private channel. Otherwise, you literally had to be within standing distance of somebody to do public chat. And we did that, and we saw how much activity was taking place with sort of friending and private channel chat. And I saw Friendster was just starting to pop. There was a site called 6 Degrees, Rise, R-Y-Z-E, that was doing
Tribe
similar
is
stuff.
around that time.
And Mark Pincus was just starting Tribe. So I went and I talked to Jonathan Abrams at Friendster. I met with Philip Rosedale, knew Mark Pincus. He introduced me to Mark. And I was starting to get excited about something like that. But having gone to Stanford for grad school, I knew a bunch of people who were at Google. And they basically reached out and said, hey, I hear you're thinking about your next thing. What intrigued you about Second Life? Because that's a really compelling project. I said, well, it was some of the smartest engineers I ever met were there. It was a hard technical challenge, but it was one that I felt like you had to understand ultimately that people were going to use this product, and so you can't just get obsessed with the code. You have to think about how do we want to change the world. And I thought it had the possibility to touch not 5,000, not 50,000, not 500,000 people, but to touch 5 million, 50 million, 500 million people ultimately. That's all they had to hear.
Right.
They're like, we've got some stuff to show you. Because at the time, Google was...
This is 2003?
2003.
Yeah.
So Google was search. Google had not yet gone public. They had not yet filed. So nobody really knew that there was a business here.
This is before Gmail.
This is
before Maps.
Before Gmail, before Maps. All they had was a page at google.com with a brightly colored childlike logo and the best, fastest web search out there amongst 40 search engines, right? Dogpile, Alta Vista, Excite, They started to tell me a little bit more, just a little bit, because they were always very secretive about, hey, what you're seeing right here is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot going on here. And there's some really, really smart people here. And I'll tell you what got me. What got me was coming in the lobby and staring at the scrolling list of search queries and looking and saying, my God, this is like peering inside the mind
of the whole world.
The whole world.
Yeah.
And as somebody who really started using the internet in 93, 94 with sort of news groups and then the beginning of a browser, and both loved information, loved creating, I basically turned and I said, you don't even have to pay me, just let me have access to this data. Like, this data is fascinating. I'm going to understand the world in a really, singular way. Fortunately, they ended up paying me as well. But
you're a bad negotiator.
Bad negotiator. So I had, some people at the time, Google has been and always will be, I think, sort of a quirky company. And some people had really, really long, prolonged interview processes where, like, Google would seem to be hot on you, then they'd go dark for a few months, then they'd come back, or what's your GPA, all this type of stuff. I had completely the opposite, and it's not because I'm special or anything. I think I just hit them at the right time. So they said, we have three jobs we want you to talk to us about. I was there 9 of 10 days over the course of 2 weeks. It was still in one building, so it basically was the same receptionist. She's like, do you work here yet? I'm like, I don't think so, but maybe soon.
Right.
I got offers for 2 of the 3 jobs. I hemmed and hawed a little bit because Google was about 1,000 people already, which to me was huge. I was just at a 20, 30 person company where I got to go to board meetings. But my mother said, who doesn't know anything about the business opportunity, doesn't know anything about the technology, just she listens to me describe things and helps me say, like, oh, that sounds like you or not. She's like, you keep talking about how smart these people are and how cool the information is. Like, why don't you just go? If you don't like it, leave. Like, nobody's going to fault you. So I said, okay, you're right. I need to get over myself. And I went and I stayed for 9 years.
So you start with AdSense, right?
I start on AdSense, and I start on not the product side, but more of the business side.
So AdWords had started before AdSense, right?
Yep, about within the year prior.
Right. What are you doing? At what stage is the AdSense product at this point?
Yeah, so AdSense had launched in beta about 6 months earlier. And at the time, it had launched as a beta for sort of mid and long tail online publishers. So small, let's call them like mom and pop sites, emerging sites that if they wanted to monetize, didn't have their own sales force, and at the time were forced to sort of use banner ad networks to make any money. Most of those ads weren't relevant for the average user. They were loud, graphical,
and also they weren't really
obnoxious.
friendly to smaller sites.
Weren't friendly to smaller sites. You'd get the bottom of the barrel, no responsiveness. If you like, hey, why, an ad that was serving malware popped up, how can I stop that from happening again? No answer, all that type of stuff. And so Google, in its sort of notion that ads, if they were targeted and informative and weren't contextual, could be content essentially, had used the same technology that they had built for Google.com. How do we understand what this web page is about? And the same ad network that they had built with AdWords. Do you want to advertise against relevant search results? And essentially put that into a unit on a web page that you could just easily deploy. And so if you went to a website and that you were reading about scuba diving, instead of having a smack the monkey blinking banner ad that nobody clicked on and thus you got very little money, you saw 1, 2, or 3 text ads. Scuba gear for sale, ebay.com. Want to book a trip to Belize? Best scuba diving, in the Southern Hemisphere. Click over to here. Or, other things that were relevant, not necessarily to who was viewing it. It wasn't personalized to the person on the other side of the computer yet. It eventually got there. They weren't using your cookies. But what is this page about?
Right.
And so having launched and over the 6 months being a self-service tool, I was part of a small team that started to think about, well, how do we bring this to some of the larger sites, CNN, New York Times, sites that do have salespeople, but also don't always sell 100% of their inventory, or are subject to using these same kind of untargeted banner ad networks. And can we start making ads that are relevant enough and get enough advertisers in the auction, because it was driven by an auction similar to the way AdWords is on Google.com, to make a lot of money for these websites.
And
so I did that. That's what I basically did for my first year.
Was targeting these larger publishers.
Help from the business side, build the product and roll out to large publishers that we actually had to pay. We had to in most cases, buy the ad space.
The inventory.
Buy the inventory from the large sites for the first 6 months, 9 months, year, to prove, because they were like, we don't know you, we'd otherwise sell this. You want the space? Buy it from us. Mm-hmm. What we were betting on were 2 things. One, that we could get enough advertisers were growing fast enough on the platform that in a sort of second order Dutch auction, the winner pays a penny more than the second highest bid, that we could get enough competition to sort of drive up the cost per click, and training on these sites, we could get our relevancy to the point where a year in we could say, you know what, we're not renewing our guarantee, but you see that this is outperforming every other ad platform.
Right.
Here's the rev share we want to offer you.
So you arbitrage it until eventually it gets good enough that
exactly. So we could built the scaffolding with dollars and then pulled away the scaffolding and let the algorithm do its thing.
Wait, I made the point earlier about with Second Life and creating the platform and the juice for Web 2.0, because I remember this really clearly, that AdSense especially laid a foundation for what would become Web 2.0, because not only is this part of the blogs are becoming a thing and so many blogs used AdSense and things like that, but there was that brief period of time where you could raise money for startups where part of your business plan was, well, we'll put up AdSense. Right. Like the most famous being most successfully would be Plenty of Fish, but so creating that sort of financial infrastructure that allowed Web 2.0.
Well, if I mentioned that, the thing that struck me on sort of day one of visiting Google as a potential employee was the scrolling list of search queries. Once I got there and started the AdSense team, the next amazing trove of data I had access to was, oh my God, this community site about dogs is making $500,000 a year. Mm-hmm. You started to see really where time and attention was going on the web. And that informed my work at YouTube. It informed some of the investments that we've made. But it also taught me that you don't have to be, you can start from scratch as a content creator and build a business. And the connective tissue for me between Second Life, AdSense, and YouTube was I really like technology as a tool of creation. I like it as taking place within communities for both audience and collaboration, not just sort of something you do by yourself. And then I think it's inherent upon these platforms to create economic models that allow the creators to benefit from their work. So Second Life had an economy. You could make money if you chose. It wasn't a world about making money, but you could. AdSense, as you mentioned, like at the time, there were 8 blogging platforms. You could roll your own site. It was really AdSense was the back end, the monetization engine for web publishing. And then YouTube, of course, was all of those things just with video as opposed to web pages. So like for me, even though sometimes it's not like I spent 12 years doing the same thing, there's definitely a relationship between Second Life, AdSense, and YouTube in the impact that I think technology can have and the role that I wanted to play in that.
We need to get to YouTube. Did you
Sure.
have a hard out at 5, or because I'll ask different questions depending on how much time you got. It's about 10 till 5.
Like 5:15.
Okay, great. So let's then spend just a few minutes on, because I've said on this show before that in my opinion the 3 big IPOs of the internet era were obviously Netscape, but then Google sort of proving to Silicon Valley but also to the world that, hey, this web thing isn't over, the internet is not over, it lives, essentially. Experiencing it within Google as a Google employee, did you guys have the sense that it was going to be as big as it was, that this was sort of the herald of reviving the Valley and things like that?
So we filed our S1 in maybe Q1 2004, early Q2. So I had gotten there late in Q3. At that time, there were, oh my God, wow, this company is making a lot of money. Once you're inside. Outside, you start to hear rumors. Mm-hmm. Google, there's something here. April 1st, 2004, we released Gmail. People thought it was an April Fool's joke.
Right, yeah.
Google Maps comes out, so you start to see other aspects of this emerge, what it means to organize the world's information. And then all of a sudden, this S1 drops that has our financial information and an intent to go public. And people were astounded at,
I remember very clearly, yeah.
The amount, the growth rate, what Google was doing. You still got questions of, wait, why do you need 800 people, 1,000 people, 2,000 people to operate a search engine? Are they typing in results? But Google was investing in all these other areas. And when I got there, it was about 1,000 people. When I moved over to YouTube, it was at the end of 2006, beginning of 2007, it was 12,000. So we were doubling headcount year over year. When the S1 came out, I feel like the S1 coming out internally was a bigger day than the IPO day itself. Whereas for the rest of the Valley, the IPO day was the big day. Because internally, it was a declaration. People who had been there a while knew now, wow, I'm going to be able to buy a house. This changes my life. Okay, let's get back to work. Mm-hmm. Then when the IPO occurred, that was where the general public could finally buy in and own, the retail investor could start to buy stock in this company that people had a ton of affinity for. You'd wear a Google t-shirt, a Google hat, not just in San Francisco, but on an airplane, and people would tell you how much they love their, love the search result. They'd tell you about the amazing thing it found. They'd tell you about people, one of the ways that people would assess search engine quality is a vanity search. They would type their name and see what came up. And so they would tell you how Google was the only one that found this amazing thing. They didn't even know their high school yearbook was online, and Google found it. So it wasn't even so much, it was a long tail of searches and right. Vanity searches where people said, like, this is amazing. Google used a non-traditional way of IPOing. So Google's business was based on an auction. Advertisers could name what they wanted to pay, and then that was one of the factors in where they sort of showed up in the list. And so Google also used an auction to find its IPO price. At the time, there was a ton of skepticism. And in fact, it's possible that the price at which Google went public, the amount of money Google as a company got, was lower than it could have been if Google had played Wall Street's game.
I was going to say, it wasn't just skepticism, there was antagonism from Wall Street.
Yeah, because they were losing out on what they like to do is oh, this stock is worth $100, let's price it at 80. It'll get a pop, and we'll be able to buy the shares at 80, then give them to our preferred clients. It'll pop right away to 100, and they'll pat us on the back because we just made them 25%. Now, you go back to the Web 1.0 bubble, that pop was sometimes 300%, 400%. A stock would come out at
in a day.
A day. I mean, maybe even more if I think back. Like, people talk about the Globe and all these things.
Yeah.
Open at 9, close at 87, right? But we all know what happened, a year or two later. So this IPO occurs, and it prices low. It prices people, but people start buying shares, and all of a sudden, we have to start to live up to not the expectations of what Google is today. Google was in the day. But oh my God, now we have the resources. People got to. I mean, we can start doubling down. We can grow.
Yeah.
And so I think people, the culture didn't change dramatically. Google, many more people were hired post IPO than pre IPO. Google was able to retain a lot of those newly independent, wealthy folks for quite a while because Google, if you're interested in working in data sets, where else are you going to go? What are you going to do? You're going to retire at 30? Like, stay here and work. But I mean, I think it was a wonderful day for technology, a big day for sort of San Francisco and the Valley, and even though I was employee 1,000, not employee 10, had a meaningful impact on my life as well.
All right, so let's jump to YouTube. I don't need you to tell me the YouTube story, obviously.
Yeah. So YouTube's a video website.
No, right. Well, and hopefully Chad and Steve and everybody eventually can tell me that story. But I'm curious, again, from inside Google, was that a controversial buy? Because Google, people forget this, but Google had its own product
Google
to compete
Video.
with YouTube.
Yeah.
So Google doing that acquisition, that's one of their first really, really big ones. I mean, $1.5 billion doesn't seem that big today, but what was the opinion of that within?
So I had something. So in 2006, the acquisition was announced in fall 2006 and closed by end of the year, and it was a startling amount of money for a site that people would derisively talk about it being about dogs on skateboards. I had the chance in 2006 to work with the Google Video team a bit because under the Adsense umbrella, I had been starting to see that video wasn't just a destination site experience. It wasn't just something you'd go to a YouTube or go to a Google Video, but all of the sites in the Adsense network wanted video as content. If you were running a blog about the NBA, about basketball, you were hungry for highlights, and so we built a product that allowed the NBA, for example, to syndicate ad-supported basketball highlights to any site that wanted to put that unit up. So it's essentially like monetizing a YouTube embed,
right?
And sharing that with the site, not just with the content owner.
That's what was so crucial also to YouTube's growth, was that the embeddability. It's sort of the old Hotmail viral model of people would discover it by, oh, how did that video get on that website? Right. Oh, it's this YouTube
exactly
thing.
They grew on the back. I mean, it was MySpace especially, and it was never a significant percentage of playbacks, but it certainly introduced people to what YouTube was. So like MySpace at least once, if not more, kept trying to block YouTube embeds because they saw what was happening. But YouTube had a much better technical team than MySpace did, and the cat and mouse game went on for a while. And also users were outraged. They're like, wait, what is the name of this company? MySpace? Yeah. I want to put this music video on MySpace. And what I saw, so from my point of view, as I was working with publishers, websites, and content owners to start syndicating these clips and things, I would be looking at these, the NBA sports website, and I'd say, well, hey, I've got NBA clips that you can put on here, and guess what? You'll even get paid to show them. And they say, that's great, but like this isn't the content I want. I just go to YouTube and I have all this stuff, that I can pull off YouTube and put on embed, and that drive traffic. And it's like, oh man, I'm seeing this YouTube stuff everywhere. So we were all obviously aware of YouTube's growth. So Eric Schmidt, it was September, October, something like that. Eric Schmidt got the Google Video team in a room and said something to the extent of, we're about to announce that we are buying YouTube. The Google Video team wasn't largely involved in that decision, and said, this is, it's where we're going to put our focus of video. We think Google should index video. Google can still be a place to host video, just like
how big a motivator was that, the sense that this is a competing search?
Google, if you're going to organize the world's information, if you're going to be the card catalog, anytime there's a lot of information to be indexed,
Google wants to be the one doing it.
So like before YouTube, they bought Blogger,
right?
Because you had a ton of websites being created. So I see, YouTube as sort of the Blogger of video. And so they saw a explosive amount of content being uploaded and created, a lot of increasing amounts of engagement, a place you would go and go back, not just with high intent, so not just a specific video you're looking for, but low intent, entertain me, so on and so forth, which was something, that wasn't a property that Google had. All of Google's tools were aimed at how quickly can we get you off our website. This was one that was how long can we keep you. So there were a lot of differences, and I think they recognized those differences. They also knew that Google could start, with the DoubleClick acquisition, things like that this was going to be a place to put a large amount of display branded advertising, which was, sort of the other side of the internet advertising coin, and one that Google hadn't had any owned and operated properties to, put this advertising against. So the deal closed pretty quickly. At the time, there wasn't, sometimes now things go into like antitrust review, so on and so forth. Nothing like that. Google paid more than anybody else would have. And starting January 1st, 2007, I started working at YouTube. I tried to just transfer what got me over there. I hadn't known the team. I hadn't known Chad and Steve.
By the way, by over there, because it
San
was,
Bruno.
Right,
it was a separate campus.
It's functionally a different location and campus outside of the
So
Google
Chad
place.
and Steve, the founders of YouTube, and Eric Schmidt, credit to the three of them for really wanting to keep YouTube separate. YouTube was 65 people when it was acquired. It was very small, 18 months old. And there was the recognition that slamming this into Google under some VP who probably didn't understand YouTube anyway, Chad and Steve, had created something that needed to find its own way. And Eric told those guys, he said, look, you're going to have plenty of people who want to help. There's going to be a lot of folks from Google pulling on you, do this, do that, so on and so forth. I'm going to give you air cover. You tell them you use what you need from Google, and consider us your board. There's obviously oversight, but you don't have to adopt Google sign-in right away. You don't have to wholesale move all the technology over. We're not putting YouTube powered by Google, on the logo. Like, this is a community product. Go build your community.
So let's look at some of the things as you come over that you have to do. Your mandate is to continue the growth, right, and to find your audience and find your community.
Yeah. The way I sometimes describe it is, I was fortunate enough. So I came over in a role where I was actually first building out sort of the APIs. Then a month later, I helped start the mobile team, and then a month later, I was, sort of they're like, can you just run product? And so the way I think about it is, I inherited phosphorus. It was burning hot, and we had to figure out if we could turn that into a furnace. Could it burn long? That was along 3 dimensions. It was at about 100 million playbacks a day, already the largest site on the web. But by the time I left, sort of 4.5 years later, it was at 4.5 billion. So is this a consumer fad or not? How do we make sure, within the first year, we already started progressively, investing heavily in mobile, because we believed that was going to be very important. So the reason the YouTube of mobile is YouTube is because of a bunch of things, including being a default app on the first iPhone,
right,
which was a really interesting negotiation. Second was, we started to get sued. So people think YouTube sold because it couldn't have afforded the bandwidth. It wasn't that. They could have raised money. They could have started monetizing faster. It's that nobody would have funded them to fight lawsuits.
They were staring down the barrel of tons of lawsuits.
A Viacom suit eventually, and a bunch of others. And all of which were settled or dismissed. So they said, look, we're in the right. but we can't raise $1 billion to fight lawsuits. We could raise $1 billion to support, over a few years to support, a top 5 web property, but we can't raise $1 billion to pay Wilson Sonsini.
Yeah.
And Google was willing to take that risk on. So we had to continue to invest in rights management tools, make sure that we were working productively with the creative community.
And you're largely able to solve that with software, with like Content ID and things like that.
Exactly. And then the third was monetization. The first few years, up until sort of the financial crisis of 2008, the mandate was grow users, grow users, grow users. Then, the global economy starts to shiver. Google, in retrospect, I think Patrick Bichette, who is the CFO, even sort of spoke about this internally, if not externally, once we got through. He said, look, we pumped the brakes too quickly. Google was not as impacted by 2008, 2009 as they had thought. But they slowed down hiring. They laid off people. They came over to YouTube and said, remember user growth? Money.
Yeah.
So we had to, but from early on, what Chad was always focused on, and I think this is one reason why YouTube is still such a relevant, strong property, was one of the things Chad preached was monetization is important, not just to make us money, but to make the creators money. Whether you're a large media company or even more importantly, a new original creator, if we're going to help you assemble a TV-size audience, a massive TV-size audience, you should be able to get TV dollars. And so unlike Vine, unlike Instagram, unlike a lot of these platforms that said you get paid in likes, you get paid in good feels, you go off the platform and go and do your brand integration deals, so on and so forth if you want to get paid, we said, we're figuring out how to make sure that if you create great content, we're going to send you a check.
Now, is that because you guys are seeing, you made the joke that, oh, it's just dogs on skateboards, but is that because you guys are seeing internally that licensing content from CBS is not performing as well as somebody doing something smart themselves, at home is performing better for the
YouTube
audience?
product team, the YouTube community team, the YouTube engineering team, all of us saw, we didn't make assumptions about quality or premium. Those were words that business people and Hollywood people use to denigrate YouTube because they produced quality content and UGC low quality, uninteresting. We saw audiences grow. We saw people tune in multiple times a week when these creators would start to upload videos with frequency. We saw people develop personalities and shows, not 30-minute scripted content, 3, 5, 7-minute type stuff. And we also saw that their limitation wasn't flattening growth. It wasn't, oh, this is interesting for a while, but ultimately people want to go back and watch Seinfeld. And it wasn't lack of creativity. It was the fact that they had to work a job and max out their credit cards and do their own editing and buy their own camera. And if we could pay them, not prospectively, not here's a $10,000, make some videos, but if they knew that if they uploaded a video and it got to, for every 1,000 playbacks, they were getting $5, $10, whatever, because of the ads, that they could quit that job, they could hire an editor, that they could actually start
buy a better camera.
So that was the playbook that Chad knew instinctively, and we all saw from the AdSense world. We saw how these sites that came in as individual hobby blogs,
the lesson from AdSense,
quit their jobs, and hired 2 more writers, and grew their audience as they improved their content. So we said this is no different than what we saw in AdSense. And by the way, we have an ad engine that plug in here. So that's where the sort of economy of YouTube came from. Now there was skepticism at various points, and the fact that the Hollywood companies are difficult to deal with helped because you'd run pilot experiments with bad content. It of course wouldn't perform. The media companies would get mad because they think anything they produce is gold, and that would give us also the underperformance would allow us to make the case to the business side of the house of like, this is not a platform about random clips from that the studios want to provide us. In fact, if the studios are interested, what they should be doing is figuring out how to monetize when the fans upload that stuff. And so that's where Content ID came in. Instead of building a DMCA shopping cart, a takedown engine, we built a leave up tool, a micro licensing where if we could automatically detect if your IP, based upon sort of fingerprints, reference files you gave us, appeared in fan videos, and give you, the rights holder, you know, Bono, if it was a U2 song, the automated choice of saying, hey, when you find this music, you know, take it down, it's mine.
Or leave it up and
or leave it up, put an ad against it, and send me the check.
Right.
And so YouTube became, you know, for all of the questions around the rights issue, YouTube solved that. You know, the lawsuits were solved because the court said, no, they're following DMCA safe harbor. They're not responsible because they have a process in place. Repeat infringers get terminated from the site, so on and so forth. But the opportunity overall actually got solved via technology, which was, why don't we just send you a check?
Real quickly, how important also was the getting YouTube on every TV, getting YouTube on every phone? You know, I feel like you and Netflix both were pursuing this model at the same time.
The phone was the key. So Apple was, so part of being, you know, you sort of referenced earlier being independent. The real interesting part of independence we had for those first 2 years was we did deals with Apple, Facebook, and Twitter. I mean, folks that had very different relationships with Google proper.
Yeah.
But YouTube got to sort of think differently. And we said, look, all of this is co-opetition, and we're not going to figure out a 100-page agreement is not going to solve this. What'll solve this is trying to figure out how to do things that we think users will like. And if the users like it, we both win. So Apple, who had already been talking to us about different ways to surface YouTube content, you know, be able to pull a clip into iMovie and edit it, you know, Final Cut Pro, like that type of stuff, came to us and said, there's something we want to talk to you about. Most of the YouTube team that worked on the API, so on and so forth, to get the iPhone app ready, never saw the iPhone, didn't know anything about it. There were, I think, 2 or 3 people who got to go into the safe room, you know, in Cupertino and be like, this is what we're talking about. Otherwise, the contract just talked about like unspecified, you know, device, you know, that type of stuff. And they came and they said, look, you know, we're going to be releasing this iPhone. It's only going to come with the data plan. We think watching video on a phone is one of the most compelling uses of data and helps illustrate why this is special and different. And there's going to be, you know, they didn't talk about an app store yet. There's going to be no third-party apps.
Because they weren't doing an app store.
No app store yet.
Yeah.
What it ships with, what it ships with. It didn't ship with copy-paste, remember?
Right,
It was a pretty limited device. We want to make YouTube a default app on every iPhone. We're going to build the app, though. We need to control the experience. Now, in some respects, you could imagine that being, they weren't going to give on that. That was Steve. I mean, we were talking. This was on Jobs. Like they were sculpting every piece of that clay.
Right.
I'm not sure 5 out of 10 or maybe even 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 Silicon Valley executives would agree to that deal. We agreed to that deal because with a multi-year agreement, because we were making a bet. Of course, we had some provisions. You know, here's what it has to include: this feature set. You know, let's work in good faith on this. We had a few beliefs. The first was that the smartphone was going to be the most important device of the coming decade. The second was that the economics up until this point, if you were negotiating with carriers, it was, what are you going to pay us to put you on our deck? The dollars were flowing from the content owners, from the services to the phone companies. We saw this as an opportunity to reverse that.
Break that system.
And to say, this isn't going to be the only phone. We set precedent that YouTube enabled, YouTube inside, YouTube powered by YouTube, is a consumer expectation for these phones, we're going to have every other phone manufacturer and carrier coming to us. And, we'll build our device for that. Oh, and by the way, Android's happening.
Right.
So we did the deal. We launched as the, only third-party app. The only thing to this day that pisses me off, and we, corrected it when we didn't renew the deal and built our own app, was, said YouTube, and it was this grainy black and white TV icon.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Yeah, which was like, oh, come on. But using YouTube infrastructure, we also progressively transcoded we were getting hours and hours and hours of video per minute. I think now it's like 400 hours per minute uploaded to YouTube. Using Google Scale, we were able to retranscode every video to be available on the iPhone. Didn't happen overnight. We did it progressively. And all of a sudden, from that point on, every other smartphone that debuted with, a YouTube app, a YouTube bookmark, powered by YouTube or some other type of YouTube branding. Some of the early Sprint commercials would show phones being able to play YouTube, record YouTube, upload to YouTube. It became something that consumers would, ask about. Hey, does this phone play YouTube? Is YouTube on this phone? I mean, they don't.
And strategically for the longer term success of YouTube, as opposed to other players that have to adapt to, mobile's here. YouTube is there at the ground floor when mobile takes over.
Yeah, so we made the right call as a team early. And then it's inside baseball, but later on, my engineering counterpart and I couldn't get all the resources we wanted to double down on mobile. So we went to Andy Rubin and the Android team and sort of made the handshake of, will you give us some headcount if we make sure that the Android app is, always at parity with the site? So we couldn't control the refresh rate of the iOS app. Mm-hmm. They sort of had something that was like, within 180 days, you'll update this to include any major features, But the Android app was going to become, the YouTube on Android was sort of the flagship app. So we went to sort of Andy and said, look, we don't have enough headcount. We got to run this monetization stuff. Eric just told us we got to start making money. Can we have some heads based out of London, so it wasn't even in San Marino. Can we have a few heads to sort of make sure that the YouTube Android app is turbo, right? And so thankfully, that was again mutually beneficial. It was some inside Google horse trading, right? And allowed us to continue to over-invest in mobile. So we were able to always invest more in mobile than the business case made sense at any given time, because we were just such true believers that this would eventually be the platform for us. And it was probably the biggest experiential flank that we needed to make sure we closed and didn't let anybody in. Because if we were late, if we hadn't built a smartphone app, maybe even if we hadn't been default, somebody else would have had an equal shot at building a native mobile video experience that made YouTube look like Web 2.0. Now mobile is here. And that was one of the benefits of being at a place like Google, where you could spend a little bit of Uncle Google's money to protect your dominance.
So I really got to let you go, but you met Satya, your partner at Homebrew, at Google, right?
Yeah, so he had started in early 2003.
Uh-huh.
I started in late 2003. We spent our first year together working on that team that I referenced, bringing AdSense to larger publishers. And then he and I and another woman from that same side of the house, Katie Stanton, who later went on to Twitter and ran media over there, we all moved over to product on the same day. So Satya and I went to work for Susan Wojcicki, who was one of the early Google folks. Google started in her garage to work on different sets of AdSense products under her guidance. And then so when I went over to YouTube in beginning of 2007 was when he left Google, and we remained friends. And then in early 2013 started our venture fund.
And Susan's now the head of YouTube.
Yeah, so in a wonderful circular world, my first my first product boss at Google, is now running YouTube. 10 years after the acquisition, it would be sort of 10 years late this year. I think people still talk about it as, potentially the 1.6 billion as the, best acquisition of all time. Yes, Instagram, awesome. Maybe we'll see Oculus, and then people will talk about sort of, the next acquisition, which brought Steve Jobs back to Apple. But that was, for all, that wasn't a property that today is orders of magnitude larger, which some, if it was spun out, some of the bankers estimate, would be a 80, 100, 120 billion dollar, company by itself. I have a 4-year-old kid who, is using YouTube, on her iPad, and she doesn't exactly get what, Daddy helped make that means. Yeah. But I'm fairly certain she'll still be using YouTube, years from now when she understands what that means.
So last thing that I want to, I actually knew this, but you mentioned it before we started talking, but since this is a history podcast, Homebrew is not named after, small batch beer creation. It's named after the Homebrew Computer Club. So
I'm amazed how few people, but I shouldn't be given the fact that it happened in the late 70s and early 80s. We started out by saying, we do want a name that can, suggests small batch, community made, sort of the values with which we sort of invest and work with these companies. And a lot of venture names tend to be somewhat pretentious. They seem to involve parts of sailboats, mountaineering or
Summit,
that type of stuff.
Right.
And we want something that was a little more cheeky. So we're like, how about Homebrew? Yeah. And I said, well, also the story behind that name. A group of PC enthusiasts during the sort of early hobbyist days, late 70s, who met on Stanford's campus to build PCs and talk about tech. And it's where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak met, and where a lot of folks who later went on to continue to put the silicon in Silicon Valley.
And Gates famously wrote a letter to them saying, "Hey, listen, pay for software, guys. It's,
right. Yeah.
It's not all a free lunch here."
And so for us, it's a nod backwards. Just like this podcast, itself is, we're so focused on disruption and what comes tomorrow, but we're only able to think about that because we're standing on the shoulders of the people who built things before us. And so if we can embody a little bit of that, now sort of writing checks instead of code to try to help founders who want to build the next Apple, the next Google, the next Facebook, then boy, we're proud and honored to do that.
Well, and that's what I'm trying to do with the show. So thank you for coming in here and sharing your story and contributing to that process.
Yeah, and I try to be pretty accessible. So I'm just hunterwalk@gmail.com.
Yeah.
If there's everything I can do for people, or if I think part of the Homebrew spirit is trying to make sure that the sort of collective information and access to all of us is out there.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.